A very, very warm welcome from me, Monica Bohm-Duchin, the director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which I hope at least some of you will already know about. For those of you who have come across the festival, the project before, you'll know that the main thrust, if that's the word, the main focus of Insiders Outsiders has been to pay tribute to the huge, rich and diverse contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. This event, you will already know it, I think, stands out. I mean, we have had many interesting and fascinating events, but this one I think is going to prove particularly emotive for a very obvious reason, because we're going to pay homage and look in detail at a very, very talented young woman, originally from Croatia, trained at the Bauhaus. We'll hear much more about that, who comes to this country and for a whole variety of reasons, which Judith and Tanya will talk about, didn't thrive here, couldn't establish herself successfully. She goes back and she perishes in the Holocaust. And it's a very stark reminder of something that I think all of us have to be very profoundly aware of, that in the stories of achievement in this country, those who settled, who did well, who thrived, even there is this dark, dark, dark backdrop of the Holocaust, and may we never forget that. So let me start by introducing Tanya Harrod, who I think many of you will already know about, who in turn will introduce Judith for a very special presentation tonight. Tanya is an independent design historian living in London, who for many years has written widely on art, craft and design. Her major study, which many of you will know, Crafts in Britain in the 20th Century, a nice small subject, was published in 1999. The Last Sane Man, her biography of the potter, Michael Cardew, was published to great acclaim in 2012. And she also published an anthology of essays called The Real Thing, Essays on Making in the Modern World, a lovely title, in 2015. And she's also co-editor of the journal of, sorry, I'm going to turn that. Apologies, I should have turned that off. Right, sorry, forgive me. Yes, where was I? She's a co-editor of the Journal of Modern Craft. And most pertinently for today, she is, I understand, contributing a special chapter on Otti Berger in this country, in the UK, for a book that Judith will tell us more about. Judith Raum is working towards publishing in the not too distant future, but it's still very much a work in progress. Lovely. So again, welcome everybody, and over to you, Tanya. Tanya, you're muted.
Mute, unmute.
Mute,
The story of our age. It's a huge pleasure to introduce Judith Raum. Judith is a Berlin-based artist and writer who has studied at the Städelschule in Frankfurt am Main, the Cooper Union School of Arts and Parsons School of Design, and who in 2006 took a master's at the University of Frankfurt, working on the phenomenological theories of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Judith Raum chiefly works in installation and performance, building detailed poetic narratives that investigate economic and social history, past and ongoing economic colonialisms, and the politics of work and of gender. She's interested in overlooked and suppressed histories and in the detail of artistic and industrial production. She researches with brilliant scholarship, investigating archives and objects, communicating her findings through haunting performance lectures and exhibitions. And over the past few years, she's concentrated on the textile workshop at the Bauhaus, and in particular on the work of the great designer weaver Otti Berger, born 1898 in what was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, died 1944 in Auschwitz in occupied Poland. Judith Raum's installation Bauhaus Space was part of the IFA touring exhibition, The Event of the Thread, and all through the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus, the 100th anniversary year, she made marvelous contributions. With performances and video works and installations at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, at Yale University, at University College London as part of the Annie Albers and the Modernist Textile conference, where I was lucky enough to hear her, at Harvard Art Museum, and at the Textile Museum Tilburg in the Netherlands. More recently, her installation last year, Day by Idle Day, at the Kunsthaus Hamburg, mixed textile of the kind designed by Berger with video projections of Berger's letters to friends when trapped in her home village in what is now Croatia from 1939 to 44. And just about to open on June the 24th until October, are two shows by Judith Raum, which she is actually in this moment in the process of installing at the Dessau Bauhaus Museum and the Dessau Bauhaus building, in which she is sitting at this moment. These celebrate the museum's acquisition of 4 textiles designed by Berger, coupled with an installation by Judith Raum in this actual textile workshop from which she is giving this talk of the Bauhaus building, that also reflect on Otti Berger's work. In her work as a creative artist, I feel that Judith Raum offers scholarly insights that outface much of the research of conventional art and design historians. So tonight we have torn threads, aspects of the life and work of the textile designer, Otti Berger. So thank you for being here, Judith.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everybody. I'm very honored and happy to be here. And I'm especially happy that I can present in these marvelous spaces, which are the spaces I will make the site into the spaces possible for you for a moment, the original site of the textile workshop in Dessau, where parts of my installation are already installed now, a steel structure, and many meters of curtain materials will follow in the next days. Good. Start with the presentation. I need to share my screen. Okay. I feel it is necessary that I give you an idea of why I started to work with the textile workshop at the Bauhaus as a visual artist, and why I focus on Otti Berger in my current work. My impression is that many people are familiar with Annie Albers, apart from Gunther Stölzel, the most famous weaver associated with the textile workshop at the Bauhaus. You might have seen one or the other exhibitions of Albers' work in 2019 at Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen in Düsseldorf in Germany, or at the Tate Modern in London. It is great that Annie Albers' pictorial weaving is finally receiving wide recognition and has entered the Olymp of modern art, if I may call it like that. In part, this is because she was able to continue building her career and take care of her legacy, as did her colleague Gunther Stölzel, who was the first and only female form master at the Bauhaus. Otti Berger never had the chance to do so. She was murdered in Auschwitz at the age of 46. Her career was brutally brought to an end. With the exception of some rugs, Otti Berger did not leave any unique pieces behind for which the value system of conventional art history or the art market might apply. Rather, her importance lies in the way she made design principles of the Bauhaus applicable for industrial production processes in the textile industry. Her importance also lies in the level in which she insisted on experimentation in designing a fabric. And she wrote a number of theoretical texts on the medium textile. I will stop that, okay. She wrote a number of theoretical texts on the medium textile, among them her text Fabrics in Space, Stoffe im Raum in German, which is exemplary for the way in which she and a few co-weavers succeeded in giving a theoretical framework to the medium textile. By writing about their medium, or her medium, Otti Berger and others managed to pull weaving out of an obscurity, which was the effect of the textile medium being traditionally associated with crafts and seen as a female medium, and as such widely debased, also at the Bauhaus itself. Otti Berger spent the final month of her professional life in London, where she left a lot of her fabrics with a friend before leaving for Yugoslavia, her home country, in 1938. She did not manage to settle professionally in Great Britain, and we'll discuss the context and reasons for her failure towards the end of this talk. After the war, in 1952, when it had become clear that Otti Berger would never return, Walter Gropius's secretary, Hanna Lindemann, arranged for the suitcases with the materials of Otti Berger to be sent from London to the Busch-Reisinger Museum in Cambridge, USA. Most of the images I will show in this talk are taken in their collection. So to give a brief introduction about my methodologies as an artist, how do I deal with the estate of a textile designer as an artist and researcher? It all started with a commission for an installation work on the Bauhaus textile workshop, which I got in 2016. How to proceed with the task of looking at a workshop, the workshop you're seeing, you're looking at this image in which you saw before in reality behind me. How to proceed with the task of looking at a workshop that had existed for 13 years, starting off as the so-called women's class in 1920 at the Bauhaus in Weimar, and following quite different notions of what weaving would be throughout its existence. More than 90 individuals passed through the workshop and left their traces. In previous projects, I was used to do archival research for many of my artwork, my previous artwork, but this time it was for the most part fabrics to be read, not correspondences. Upon the very first contacts with the material in archives, at that time it was at the Bauhaus archive in Berlin, I was intrigued by the outstanding material quality of most of the Bauhaus functional fabrics, something that did not at all manifest itself in two-dimensional illustrations, but only when you held these fabrics in your own hand and were able to feel the rigidness, softness, the warm or cold character, all depending on the yarns that had been used. On the photographs I'm showing you here, you see how important it was to be able to see the edges of the fabric, where in this case, the shininess and translucency of blue and black cellophane threads show. How important it was to be able to lift and turn the fabric in order to study and understand not only its front side, but also its reverse, and thus understand its inner construction. And how important it was to be able to bend the fabric in order to understand its shine, its behavior in light. All of this is lost in a flat photographic rendering of the fabric. Here you have it in flat form. Soon it was Otti Berger's fabrics that left the deepest impression on me. So I made two decisions right from the start. I wanted to concentrate on functional fabrics instead of unique pieces such as wall hangings or carpets or rugs. The functional fabrics, upholstery fabric, curtain fabric, wall spanning fabric, seemed to me like bundles of condensed energy. For the making of these commercial fabrics, the creative ambitions of the Bauhaus had to be converted into a more reproducible and accessible form, a fascinating process of condensation and abstraction, which I think is artistic in itself. And the second decision was, I wanted to enable the viewers to have a similar experience with the fabrics as I myself had had in the archives. I wanted the visitors to be able to touch and turn the fabrics, to experience them physically. So I decided on commissioning large-scale reconstructions of selected fabrics. And what you see here is the reconstruction of 18 meters of an Otti Berger curtain material that happened these very days in a weaver's workshop in Halle in Germany. And the fabric is now out of the machine and has arrived at the dyer's place where it will be dyed in night blue color for this exhibition. So all the installations I developed contain reweavings of length of fabric. You see Otti Berger curtain fabric material in this installation, but they also get close to the fabrics in a non-material sense. Behind each fabric is a person. The weavers wrote about their work. Their words appear in the installations in form of texts texts, video projections, or videos with voiceovers. So a few glimpses into the installation Bauhaus space of 2017. Here in this installation, I presented Otti Berger fabrics, 2 materials designed by her, reweavings of these fabrics, together with designs by other authors. And from that place, I went on working on Otti Berger specifically or exclusively. You can see here that people can touch and examine the fabrics in the installation. For an installation at the Grassi Museum Leipzig in 2019, it was Otti Berger's designs for the Bauhaus woven curtain collection of 1932. So I began to concentrate on specific time periods in her oeuvre for each distinct installation or show. And for this collection of woven curtain fabrics, she had developed heavy, shiny designs, and she had also chosen industrial materials such as tools, lace nets for the window, which I used in the installation in large scale. And the same material went into an installation last year, which Tanya already mentioned, where I began to paint on that semi-transparent material and combined it with video projections of excerpts of Berger's letters talking about her situation in exile. So for the talk tonight, allow me to shift between times, shift between fiction and non-fiction, as I'm allowed to do so as an artist. And let's begin backwards with Otti Berger in 1941 and slowly move back to her time in England in 1938. And then again jump into a fictional time space in which she might still be alive in the present and meditate on her own work. And I will try if the full screen mode works in this case. February 22nd, 1941. Otti Berger, Zmajevac, Baranja, Yugoslavia. My dear Pia, how happy I am with your letter, if you only knew. I haven't much to tell you. The winter was terrible here in the village. My brother and I are running in narrow circles like 2 lions in a cage. My poor mother is our keeper, but her loving gaze always calms us down. My brother is still making collections and he is a marvel. Isolated here, without any stimulation, he made his collection and they are buying it in New York, over 1,000 dinars postage, in Budapest, and of course, Belgrade. For my part, back in autumn, I began making rugs, but I had no material then and unsuitable colors. Then the dyer made me wait 2 months and so on. But now I have the material to some extent, and hooray, it will be the most beautiful carpet of the age, which isn't saying much, since mostly terrible ones are made. So now I am actually completely happy. I work on it the whole day. It is dark, lighter blue, and dark red pink, etc. From far off, it looks plain, a shimmering surface of one color, but then close up, you can see the structures. Have you any idea what a joy it is to make a rug? Of course, I made no design on paper beforehand. I just went at it. That way I am not tied down, and anyway, working to a pre-established design is not my thing. That way, it would always have something stiff and paperish about it. I only know what I want. And sometimes I want to dictate things, sometimes the rug is in charge. It is 180 centimeters wide and will be around 2.25 meters long. At first, I began quite dark, And now the first ray of sunshine is already in it. And afterwards, the spring and summer colors will come into it. Wait and see. Will I ever be able to show it to you? Otherwise, I have no prospect of work here. For a while, this was very distressing, but now the rug consoles me. Our greatest worry, of course, is that the war will somehow catch up with us. Until now, we are keeping our balance okay. Hopefully, things will stay like that. What is fabric anyway? A fabric is not just an optical object. We constantly come into contact with it. Therefore, a fabric also has a grasp. What is fabric? A mesh of threads. What is a weave? The way of meshing threads. Why different weaves? To give the necessary tautness, softness, or elasticity to the fabric, depending on its function. Why are different materials included in the fabric? To intensify these properties even more. We investigate the relationship in the fabric between color and material, between color and structure, and we see that the possibilities for making fabric have no limits. The first requirement is harmony between the various materials. Harmony between hard and soft, thick and thin, matte and glossy. The next requirement is balance in the structure. In other words, the floating and crossing of the various threads in relation to durability, elasticity, and hygiene. The third requirement is harmony of color. A final important requirement is the overall balance between purpose and structure and quality and color. Unlimited possibilities open up for anyone who understands these relationships within fabrics. They know that not every material is suitable for every structure. Not every color goes with every material. Material changes through structure. Color changes through material and structure. Smooth structures reflect light, but rough structures almost suck up the light, forming shadows. In this context, it is possible to speak of sculpting in fabric. Fabric becomes a form of expression. So why do we still need flowers, vines, ornaments? The fabric itself is alive. You have to do more than understand the structure with your brain. You have to feel it with your subconscious. Then you will know the particular quality of silk, which is warmth, and of rayon, which is cold. You can grasp the rawness of hemp or wool. We don't want pictures. We want to come to the best possible, definitive, living fabric. Now, fabric in space. This is a functional fabric, and so we must ask about its function, and then about its arrangement, whether stretched out, hanging, or laid flat. The curtain material must be tested for its level of translucency or opacity. Should it simply diffuse the sunlight, protecting us from it, or should it even darken the room? The curtain material must fall softly. It should be yielding when we grasp it. It is pushed to one side. The function of a wall covering is to protect the wall, insulate against heat or cold, perhaps increase the light. First of all, it must appear to be stretched taut and must be hygienic, ideally washable. Furniture fabric must be close-knit and impermeable because it is subject to heavy use. Otti Berger, 8 Gordon Street, London. Dear Slava, I am always alone and things are so hard for me because I can't speak English and can't hear that you really can't imagine that. The English are very reserved. I just can't picture my future. Now it seems that this place will not be the last stop for me either, and I'll probably keep going further, probably to America. Ach, Slava, do you have any idea how tired of this I am? We moderns thought we were so important, especially within the monastery walls of the Bauhaus. Now you can see just how little we were needed. Even most moderns have no idea about the essentials, and the others feel quite happy in their old or modern rubbish. In Germany, it was quite different. There were the Werkbund organization, which backed us and dealt with the entire industry. If everything hadn't been wrecked by political interventions, there could have been extraordinary things achieved in these last years. The masses were prepared there, and it would not have been so hard to bring our work closer to them. But here, like being dropped in the Middle Ages. The whole modern thing is for snobs. They connect with things that we already overcame, with cubism, exactly what we fight so hard against, formalism. In that respect, I'm very pessimistic. Maybe I am being pessimistic. If I wanted to start all over again now, I would run a chicken farm. That would have some meaning.
Undrar vem hon hade träffat i London. Hon tyckte att det var snobs.
Looking out of the window, the United States, I didn't think I would ever come here. For 3 or 4 years, I kept waiting for a visa to enter this country. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy had indicated that I should be the one to build up the textile workshop at the new Bauhaus, Chicago, but he never sent a concrete contract. And the recommendation letters that Walter Gropius wrote, stating that my work realizes more perfectly than anybody else's of his followers the peculiar idea of the Bauhaus, were in vain. But here I am. They are planning to do an exhibition of my work at the MoMA in New York. Oh well. It's not the first time that my work shall be on exhibit there. Gropius had 2 of my rugs in his Bauhaus exhibition of 1938. But the upcoming show will focus on my designs for the industry. I convinced the curators that the functional fabrics I made are the best exemplifying the degree to which I pushed my working principles. First, explore and push the qualities of the material to the limits. Material is always first, then technique and purpose. Secondly, develop an individual concept for each fabric, meaning develop a new and specific warp for each fabric. But the functional fabrics also stand for something else, for a continuity of my interests and design principles from Bauhaus times to post-Bauhaus times. As works from the years after the Bauhaus often get overlooked, this is an important thing for me to show. So the exhibition will concentrate on curtain fabrics, upholstery fabrics, and wall spanning fabrics. And I expressively wished to put my gauze and net fabrics at the center, starting with the ones I designed for the Bauhaus Textile Workshop in 1932, just before we all had to leave Dessau. It struck me to find out that no samples of my gauze fabrics survive in German archives. Even worse, they were forgotten there. All of them are preserved in American archives. This is why I am here. I always felt a deep connection with these net structures, masters of illusion as far as their construction is concerned. With open weaves, you often no longer know if you are looking at something knitted, something woven, or a net. They speak of interlacing in general. Used at the window, they modulate gaze, light, and air. They act as mediator between inside and outside. Here you see another designer who preceded me at the Bauhaus, Friedel Dicker, sitting at the window. Between her and the outside, a lace net. We already had a tradition of designing translucent window curtains or gauze fabrics at the Bauhaus. For our first industrial collaboration, the collaboration with the Polytex company, we designed a few of them. They all were open weave gauze fabrics. 2 warp threads overlap at regular intervals, and the weft enters through the openings or loops this creates. So 2 warp yarns are twisted around a weft yarn, holding it in position. My colleagues Gunther Stölzel and Margaret Leishman are the creators of most of these gauze designs. Although I supervised the development of the samples for the Polytex company during the summer of 1930, I wouldn't have chosen the yarns they did. The rather thick, round cord made of shiny artificial silk, too ornate for my taste. Nor do I think the technique, the gauze or lino weave, is the best solution for modern standards. A lino weave, when used in this way, brings out the look of hand weaving. Usually, visually, the horizontal weft yarns are the dominant element in the fabric's structure. Depending on their thickness or twist, they give a certain irregularity to the fabric, as is typical in hand-woven cloth. I'd rather go a more radical way and search for a textile company that produces on bobinette machines, so to enter into the family of lace instead, and then abstract from that to arrive at simple cotton nets for the window. Lace is much flatter and plainer than gauze weaves. Lace inhabits the threshold between interior, window, and outside like a very thin skin, and it is much better in letting sunlight and air through while keeping the gaze out. So for the second collection of woven curtain fabrics we developed at the Bauhaus, I looked for a close collaboration with a manufacturer who could do both, woven fabric and lace. For the laces within the collection, our goal was to offer alternatives to a category of window laces that was produced on harnessed lace machines and had figurative patterns and ornamentations in them. The Bauhaus woven curtain collection was meant to offer standard types, plain and elegant designs that would last for a longer period of time, not only for a season. We also aimed at suggesting plainer ways to install these nets. Let's go back. In contrast to tastes in interior decoration that were prevalent at the time, here to show you the worst possible, a waste of material, and in combination with it, printed curtain fabrics, floral motifs, vines, ornaments. It is this kind of lapses that I describe in my text on fabrics in space. The appeal of a fabric design should lie in it having no pattern. Material and structure are the elements that create a lively fabric. So I used the parameters of the lace production and chose basic geometrical shapes from the more abstract types of nets of the time in order to develop simplified versions of these. The material is pure cotton, slightly treated with a resin finish to give the fabric a stiffer touch. A company in Saxony, in the eastern parts of Germany, produced them by the yard. We offered them in 3 different widths at 60 inches, 120 inches, and 180 inches. The machines that produce these laces are 30 to 36 feet long. There were a couple of Saxon producers in the 1930s who had specialized in this kind of cotton nets, the so-called English curtain. I actually think there were more than 80 manufacturers of them. It struck me to learn that none of these companies exist anymore in Germany. Since the 1870s, all of them were equipped with machines from England, Nottingham. None of these machines survived in Germany, I heard. We were lucky to find one single producer worldwide who can still make such window nets today in the UK. Before entering the US, I visited this mill. For the upcoming exhibition, they are going to reconstruct one of my cotton nets from the 1930s. By the way, from today's perspective, it could look as if Lily Reich had been the one to introduce the idea of developing industrially produced laces into the Bauhaus textile workshop. The Bauhaus curtain collection of the year 1932 was created under her directorship in the weaving workshop. However, it was not her, even though she clearly had a preference for these kinds of materials. She used them in almost every interior design she did, of which I have seen illustrations. The nets soften the light and atmosphere in the space, which are otherwise dominated by steel and polished surfaces. Remarkable how she applied curtains of 2 different colors in the space, in addition to nets on the window, in order to divide the room clearly into 2 zones. It was uncanny for me to see this image of the Kunstseidenverkaufsbüro, the artificial silk sales office in Berlin, taken some time between 1933 and 1934. Hitler and Hindenburg on the wall, floating above tubular steel furniture. Hitler would become my fate. At the time, Lily Reich still determined my fate. In the development of the woven curtain fabric collection, we would have ongoing disagreements. She wouldn't take costs for raw materials and production into account as a first thing. For me, determined to overcome the rather elaborate designs that our workshop had developed for industrial cooperation in the prior years, adjusting to parameters of industrial production and cost calculation had absolute priority. The collection we developed together never sold. The Bauhaus closed soon after anyway. The bad relationship between Lily Reich and myself meant that my teaching contract at the Bauhaus ended when the institution had to move to Berlin. Consequently, I did not meet Philip Johnson there, as my friend and colleague Annie Albers had a chance to. Instead, I opened my own laboratorium for textiles in Berlin. Right in October 1932. What an undertaking. Now, looking back at it, a year before Hitler took over. Financially, those were very hard times. I often didn't know from where to take the money for the materials, let alone for the rent. Laces kept interesting me throughout my times as a freelancing textile designer. Some larger pieces that I did at the time survive. Here you see designs for curtains or blankets that use thick, untwisted cotton or viscose threads. I think that these fabrics are especially successful. A lino weave that, due to the irregularly spun thick viscoses, giving the fabric the look of a knitwear. I like the crossover between these different families of fabric. Here is a black and white image of the same piece. When I was looking through my sample books of the time, which are now stored here at the Busch Reisinger Museum, I was reminded to which extent lace and open weave techniques were on my mind then. I experimented with lino weaves and used soft and thick, almost untwisted cotton yarns in the weft, or I applied a very irregularly spun viscose in a plain weave. For more loose and open grid structures, I used jute or hemp. These materials were intended to be used as room dividers. Annie Albers recently sent me some of the samples she was working on in the 50s, among them some open weave fabrics too. Seeing the similarity between our work reminded me of the times at the textile workshop at the Bauhaus. There was a very intense exchange. We would share and exchange samples of individual fabrics that each of us developed. Often, several of us worked on one and the same warp. Here you see me in Dessau sitting on the loom on the left, teaching. In 1933, my contract with Wohnbedarf AG in Zurich, Siegfried Gideon's company, started. I owe this engagement to Walter Gropius. How did he put it in a letter to Gideon? After a couple of very successful engagements with the textile industry, she just opened her own studio in Berlin. Of all designers who graduated from our textile workshop, she worked the most systematically and successfully and developed various ideas concerning material and weave construction, most of them not taken up by industry yet. The Wohnbedarf company asked for designs for affordable window curtains. Some of the curtains I developed for them clearly pick up the idea of the lace or cotton net. International textile magazines wrote reviews. The caption for this illustration here, for example, makes it very explicit. Curtain fabric woven in the style of a lace net. In these works, I was using a lino weave in order to imitate the look of a lace net. I like to push for moments where this kind of optical confusion occurs. The same for net fabrics that took the look of a knitted fabric. At one point, the net idea completely took over. Isn't the nature of nets that you can get caught in them? I'm going to show you two black and white images. Ernst Nipkow, a Berlin-based photographer, took them. He was so good in working out the transparency and haptic character of the fabrics through special lighting effects. In most of these photographs, we would show the edges of the fabrics, the unraveled yarns, to give a sense of the quality of the material, shiny or dull, stiff or soft. Planning to settle in England, I even applied for British patents for these Wohnbedarf fabrics. My collaboration with Wohnbedarf ended. My collaboration with Wohnbedarf company had just started after I had finished working with architect Hans Scharoun on his house Schminke in Löbau in 1933. His architectural visions of the time were quite different from the ones Walter Gropius or Hannes Meyer followed. He soon became an important exponent of organic architecture in Germany. Scharoun had asked me to develop the textiles for his beautiful Villa Schminke. I wonder why I did not succeed with such designs in England. Look at Scharoun's spaces. The house had huge windows in order to bring nature and the seasons into the interior spaces. The different curtain fabrics I developed ranged on a scale from translucent to shiny to opaque. My aim was to choose materials for the curtains that resonate the vitalizing atmosphere of Scharoun's architecture, his joy in mixing materials and working with color. I developed curtains in red, in pale yellow, in a silvery gray, and in natural white, comparable with colors that I later used for my curtain collection for Wohnbedarf. At night, with all curtains closed, imagine them to have different colors. One would be surrounded by a textile skin. So far my excursion into Otti Berger's work and the end of the official part of my talk. And now we could continue with the dialogue between Tanya and myself on Otti Berger's designs for Helios in Great Britain, in Manchester. And yeah, I have prepared a couple of images where I can work out, or we can work out together, similarities to some of the fabrics I showed you in the past couple of minutes, or also, ways in which she took on new ways or different ways in her design practice. And Tanya and I have also prepared a few reflections on Otti Berger's networks in England and her daily life. in exile. Tanya.
Yes, I just wanted to make a sort of general point that are we sort of to blame? Was English culture to blame for Otti Berger's sad fate? It seems so extraordinary that a textile designer who was known throughout Europe had such a difficult time in England. There's an extraordinary letter you showed me from that she wrote to Alexander Dorner. I think you've got an image of it, who was a rather radical museum director. And she sort of explains something of the situation she finds herself in. And I know a lot has been written about this kind of hierarchy that even obtained at the Bauhaus, that women were in the weaving workshop. And there was, although there wasn't meant to be, there was a sort of hierarchy with perhaps architects at the top. But that seems to play out when she's in London. That artists and architects are given more attention than textile designers, and that's partly because we had a huge textile industry, but these were largely anonymous figures. People in London were more attuned to the idea of an artist or an architect. And in this letter, she says very poignantly, I'm just a weaver. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about that, Judith. There is something inherently mysterious about weaving, and the kind of movers and shakers in intellectual sort of London society, I don't think we're really educated enough in textile to realize who they had in their midst.
Yeah, thank you. I find that a very interesting question. I mean, what I know from letters of Otti Berger is that, or also from her theoretical text, is first of all that she would insist on not calling her practice an art practice. She wouldn't want to call her designs art. She was absolutely putting herself into a distance to that. Really saying, yeah, I believe I'm doing industrial. It was basically the idea of industrial design, right, that she followed. And so I guess she wouldn't advertise her work under the notion of art, which would make it maybe more difficult to enter into certain groups. And then secondly, she insisted on a very timely work process, which she had a difficulty to explain even to her closest collaborators, like Siegfried Gideon, who she worked together with for 2 years with the Wunbedarf company. There are these letters where she tries to explain to him why she needs a certain honorarium for her work, or why she needs a certain percentage to be paid for her fabrics if they are ever sold, because her work is so time intense in designing each single fabric anew. This is what I was mentioning before in the text. She insists in these letters that for every fabric, she invents a new concept, and that means also using a new warp. And anybody of you who knows about weaving technique knows how extremely time consuming it is to put the warp threads into the loom. So, and she says in comparison to somebody like Breuer, who designs a chair on the paper maybe, my designing process is so much more time intense. And I guess, I mean, it took me, who I'm not a weaver myself, but I'm in great contact, intense dialogue with the textile designers all the time. But of course, somebody from the outside, if you're not in the textile business, it's very hard to understand the inner logic and the inner necessities of the craft, and that way arrive at a position to cherish it and to appreciated also, right? My guess is that these were some of the hardships.
I think another problem was in Britain, the textile industry was away from London. It was in Manchester, it was in the Midlands. It was in a world that, you know, seemed very, very different. And you have this marvelous figure, Sir Thomas Barlow, who's a great collector of Dura, a great connoisseur, but he also totally appreciates how remarkable and extraordinary Otti Berger is. And he writes this very moving letter in which he says, you know, he believes her to be, I had a very distinguished weaver by name, Miss Otti Berger, who was formerly of the Bauhaus, working for me as weaving designer at one of our mills. And he says, she is, I think, one of the most gifted weavers at present living. But paradoxically, who does he send this letter to? He sends it to Leonard Elmhurst at Dartington Hall. And I don't know whether all of you know the significance of that, but Dartington's down in Devon. It's a philanthropic sort of utopian community that has already taken in emigres from Central Europe and the Netherlands, like the Jews, Ballet Jews. But its weaving capacities were extremely basic. It had only just gone over to power looms. And that to me is one of the sort of big puzzles why both Marion Straub, who worked at Helios, which was the more advanced weaving workshop set up by Sir Thomas Barlow within the context of his much bigger firm, Barlow and Jones. Marion Straub, who's Swiss and does understand sort of modernist standards, that both Barlow and Marion Straub suggest she go to this rather remote place to take up some kind of advisory role there, or perhaps to experiment, you know, with weaving. There's so many sort of ironies. For example, when Otti Berger does work at Thomas Barlow's Helios, and I know Anne Angel's going to say a little bit about Helios and her grandfather. She's replacing Marion Straub, who's actually gone with Ethel Murray, who's essentially a very craft-based hand weaver with an extraordinary knowledge of vegetable dyes and spinning and the actual texture of cloth. But she's not technically very sophisticated, unlike Marion Straub. They've gone on a little tour of Europe. This is in 1938. This is June 1938, and they visit Estonia. And then they find themselves in Berlin, where they visit the International Craft Show, the Erste Internationale Handwerksausstellung, which was very much endorsed by the Nazi regime as a kind of return to medieval guilds and handwork. There's something very tragic and sort of paradoxical that they go there, where Ethel Murray is rather impressed by this essentially rather backward-looking exhibition. And meanwhile, that time at Helios is the only chance that Otti Berger gets to show her genius. And I think you were going to say something, Judith, about what she designed for Helios was perhaps less radical than what you've shown us so far.
Yes, I just wanted to add to your mentioning Ethel Murray that, and you pointed that out to me already a couple of years ago, that she was interested in the texts that some of the Bauhaus weavers wrote, right, and had done a translation of the Otti Berger text from 1930, Stoffe im Raum, which she meant, here's her translation, her handwritten translation, which she meant to publish in a Weavers journal that she edited herself, as far as I understood, right? And she ended up not publishing it. Instead she published the text by Stölzel, right?
Right. She published a book which had an essay. It's a strange sort of amalgam. I'll just get the book actually. Yes. On that trip to Berlin via Finland, she then goes on to Switzerland and meets Günther Stölzel. And I think it's Günther Stölzel who gives her Stoffe im Raum. And she does work on this translation. But this is in 1939. So Otti Berger has gone. She's not going to return to Britain. It's sort of very tragic. And Marion Straub is consulting, helping Ethel Mary, whose German was rather good, to translate this very important theoretical piece of writing. And why it doesn't go into this, I don't entirely.
Maybe if they had met in person, it would have done so, but yeah. Yes, I wanted to, if you allow me, this is a kind of open, ongoing reflection that I only started to have myself, but I looked again at the 3 designs. I have not been to the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester yet, but what I know from the internet is that they have at least 3 designs by Otti Berger for Helios, one of which is the one you are seeing here with this kind of wave pattern, the warp in red and the weft in blue. And then she also has this dotted pattern with color, dots in 2 colors. And I saw varieties in color of these patterns in the Busch Reisinger Museum in Harvard. You see some of my photographs here of this kind of design. You see that front and reverse side always, the colors of the dots exchange, color and background color. And under the microscope or under the magnifying glass, you see how she experimented with these effect yarns. She loved these kind of bouclé and effect yarns and applied them in a lot of her fabrics. But the point I want to make is that if you compare that design, the Helios dot design, for example, to designs she made, for example, for the De Ploeg, the Gardinenweverij De Ploeg in Netherlands, for the curtain factory in the Netherlands. Here another pattern with dots reoccurs, and it's a very different understanding of a curtain fabric that she applied in these commissions for these companies. To go back to the one we just looked at, the red one, maybe similar to an effect that happens in another De Ploeg design, Thalia, the fabric Thalia. It's an understanding of the fabric that has a pattern in the sense of an abstract pattern that fills the plane, right? That fills the meters you have at the window. And it creates all these curtains, of course, create a certain optical effect close to op art, like that you really have a kind of moving effect in front of your eyes, but they do this through a pattern that is a pattern through outlines on the surface, and not so much as I find it much more interesting in most of her designs. They do this not so much through an intricate use of warp and weft and a certain weave construction, as is the case in this curtain, very simple scarf curtain in plain natural color, where she applied where she changed the density of the weave yarns, so that when the density is narrower, these stripes that you can see occur. And when the density of the warp threads is wider, then the fabric gets slightly more transparent, which means here you see a very small scale sample of the same fabric with other colors, with yellow and natural color. And you again see, it's really almost like a very subtle, like a shade, this varying density of the warp thread that creates in the end an effect of, if you imagine this in a vertical direction on the window, in the inner construction of the fabric, you have the idea of folds forming, right? What happens in this pattern through the optical effect, you will also have vertical lines, happens here in the structure of the fabric. And I find that in a sense very intriguing, and she didn't, we don't have any testimony for designs like that that she realized in England. The third example for Helios that is in Manchester is this fabric, which I find even, if I may say so, maybe the most typical Otti Berger curtain fabric design among the three of them, where she again applies a kind of effect yarn, a boucle yarn, but all in all, it's a very simple fabric, plain in color, and I would compare it maybe to fabrics she designed for Wohnbedarf, where she also worked with very plain colors, natural color, brown or white, in this case, a bourrette silk, and just through the application of certain weave constructions, she creates a certain pattern in the surface of the fabric, in this case, a kind of dice pattern. Yeah, and so my argument would be for Wohnbedarf, you see the selling spaces of Wohnbedarf in Zurich here in the 30s, and I don't know if you can see that in that small size of my images now on your laptops at home, but you see how Wohnbedarf offered quite a variety of quite extravagant, I would call it, curtain materials. You see how extremely glossy these two curtain materials are, for example. So I guess in the collaboration with Wohnbedarf, Otti Berger, because Wohnbedarf, it's known that they asked for both inexpensive and expensive designs of her. So in the category of the more expensive designs, she was able to really like go deep into her fundus, into her possibilities, creative possibilities, and use these and come out with these extraordinary designs that highlight structure and contrast of materials. As you can see in the advertisements for Wohnbedarf textiles, these fabrics are always one color, black or natural color, and have very intricate structure. Yeah, and so, for example, a similar wave pattern as in the red one for Helios, she would do for Wohnbedarf in a much rougher, coarser quality, but the pattern here is somehow more invisible, more delicate, very strange, worked out in the weave construction. So I would argue, yeah, maybe these patterns that survived for Helios are really more in this category for the industrial designs comparable to De Ploeg, that were maybe meant, yeah, for a kind of broader audience. Probably there was a price issue, and that's what she was able to realize at that time in England, nothing else. She would not, she had her pattern books with her, her sample books. Imagine when you browse, when you open these sample books and look at the fabrics, some of them here on the left side, a wall spanning fabric of semi-transparent material. Some of them contain very irritating fabrics for our eyes, very highly experimental and unseen, I would say. And yeah, somehow the circle of clients was not there. Let's put it like that. Yeah. Maybe could be a closing image in the radicality. Not everybody used curtain in a sense of an image on the window more than a functional object, as Walter Gropius, for example, did in his house in Massachusetts, where he applied a fisher net, which seems like the pop-up or a boost version of a lace net, and is more a joke or reference, mere reference than a functional object, right?
I think, though, of course, we have to sort of put her in context that most of the figures from Central Europe who were highly creative did find London, England frustrating, and their goal was to move on to the United States. And really, the tragedy was that she didn't join Gropius, Moholy-Nagy, Naum Garbo. Annie Albers had gone ahead, and whether she was vulnerable as a a single woman in you know, in a kind of unfair kind of society. I sort of feel that people were helping each other, but they were also very competitive with each other in this tragic and complex situation. You know, I keep thinking, why did Naum Garbo not write to her when she wrote to him? That sort of, yeah. But I do keep seeing Thomas Barlow as a kind of hero. When she was living in Manchester, albeit only, it seems, for about a month, she was housed in this rather remarkable hall of residence to do with Manchester University, especially for people who were hard of hearing. There was a whole department within the university to do with education for the deaf. That's where she lived when she was working on these designs.
Yes, I mean, I think we didn't mention that so far. Her disability, being almost completely deaf, certainly had an effect on the hardships she faced during her time in England, because she was looking for a teacher who she could read from the lips and needed to learn English at the same time. And yeah, I was wondering, I just thought of a letter I found where she wrote to an architect in Zurich, asking him when there was, that was at the time of the International Exhibition in Paris. I think that was in 1938, if I'm not mistaken, or 1937. She was determined to go there, and she wrote to this architect friend in Zurich if he couldn't put her in contact with Le Corbusier, because she had just finished such a beautiful and extraordinary rug, and she wanted to ask Corbusier if he couldn't include it in his pavilion at the International Exhibition. And when I read this, I thought, wow, how self-conscious, you know, how, yeah, ask Gropius if he doesn't want to include my rug. And now in this other letter that I sent to you, where she addresses Alexander Dorner, she's very disappointed, saying, listen, Le Corbusier is in town. She's in London at the time when she writes this. Le Corbusier is in town. The exhibition of the group Mars Group just opened, and there is a big dinner tonight. And of course, I'm again not invited. How shall I ever meet people? So this dilemma that many of us, of course, also know of widening your networks, or at first place activating your networks at all, because some people obviously didn't get back to her or whatever. That was obviously very hard and tough.
Judith and Tanya, I wonder, just keeping half an eye on the clock, we could listen to you for a long, long time. I'm sure everybody will agree, but maybe it's time to bring in Anne Angel to say a little bit about what I think Tanya has described as the one kind of positive episode in Otti Berger's life, when she was indeed employed by Helios. And I'd also very much like if Anna Nyberg is willing to say a few words, for her to chip in as somebody who's done quite a lot of research on those emigre textile designers who did make good in this country, which I think might prove quite a useful kind of counterbalance to what you've been discussing. So maybe Anne, if you're ready to talk, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. And I'd just like to say, Judith, I've been incredibly moved by really the most beautiful way that you've brought both Otti and her work to life in such depth. I've been asked just to say a few words because I'm the granddaughter of Felix Löwenstein. And Felix Löwenstein was invited by Sir Thomas Barlow to set up a factory for him, the factory that was called Helios in Bolton. And my grandfather had previously been a German Jewish textile industrialist. He and his brother Arthur Löwenstein, after the First World War, set up a factory called Pauser in the town of Mörsingen, which is these days 40 minutes drive from Stuttgart. They'd set it up. It was a soft furnishing fabric business, and it did everything from spinning through weaving through dyeing. And I know from my mother, who died only just a couple of years ago, that from a very early stage he was fascinated by the Bauhaus. I'm not terribly well informed, but I've had the privilege of being informed by a group of people from Mörsingen who in 2007, 2008 set up the Löwenstein Research Association because Pause had recently closed. It had been in other hands since the mid-1930s, and they wanted to discover more about Arthur and Felix. And the wonderful people of the Löwenstein Research Association, Irene Scherer, Welf Schroeter, and their colleagues, brought my mum and her first cousin back to Mersingen. They have done the most enormous amount of research. And one of the things that I learned was that my grandfather, who was the principal design side of the partnership, brought young women from the Bauhaus weaving shed to Pause in Mersingen over several years. And Lyuba Monasterskaya became head of design at Pause. Elizabeth Ostreicher headed the dyeing department. And Friedel Dicker, whom you have mentioned, spent 6 months a year, as I understand it, over several years, also at Pause, and was sent out by my grandfather to visit international exhibitions. Much of this I know from my good cousin Sandra Lustig, who's attending today, who has done a lot of the translation for me. So he was very involved in Bauhaus. He knew these people. And sadly, as we know, with the onset of Nazism, he had to begin to look for another place to live. And my cousin Sandra's grandfather, who was a professor of economics in Berlin, had already managed to flee Germany, had found a position temporarily at the University of Manchester. And that's where he met Sir Thomas Barlow. You're an enthusiast for Sir Thomas Barlow, and my late mother was too. She felt he was a real, what we call a mensch, a human being with a big heart. He had not wanted particularly to be an industrialist, but after his older brother died during the First World War, he had to, as it were, take the helm at this very large Lancashire complex. But his heart was in art and academia, and in the Senate of the University of Manchester, the governing body, he met Adolf Lowe, my grandfather's brother-in-law. Adolf told Sir Thomas Barlow about Felix Löwenstein, about the factory, and Sir Thomas Barlow invited Felix, therefore, to come and establish Helios. And for that reason, my family received visas. And through 1936 and 7, my mother, her older siblings, her father, and her mum ultimately came settled in South Manchester. Everything that you have said really resonates with me, because imagining Otti Berger living somewhere near Euston Station, which would have probably been fairly, fairly noisy. Well, she had a hearing impairment, but a difficult place to live. And having the shock then of going to Manchester, even if she was in a reasonable suburb in a nice hall, going up to Bolton, a very industrial place, can't have necessarily been the best thing for one's creative processes. I don't know what constraints or requirements were put on her in terms of design, but one imagines that life at that time was creatively difficult. I also know, though I'm not certain of the timing, that it was becoming problematic to gain materials. Cottons from Egypt, for example, may already at that point have become more difficult to get. I don't know whether that had an impact on things. And the truth of the matter is that whilst I have heard of other people, my mum never mentioned Otti Berger. My mother was, a young woman, a very young woman at the time, but sadly it's not a name that appeared. But I'm so glad you've introduced me to her fabrics. I heard of them first when listening to Rabbi Dr. Michael Shire in December in a lecture for Limud, and through this I've met you amazing women who are beginning to bring these threads back up into the light. So thank you very much for that.
Wonderful, and thank you so much. Do you think we might hand over now to Anna? Is that okay with all of you, to say a few words to put Otti Berger perhaps in the broader context?
Yes, sure. I'm Very happy. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
That's good. Okay. Well, I'm sure you're all textiled out, so I'll keep it very, very brief. A really, really short gallop. But you know, there was another story that very many people, very many textile designers did manage to come to Britain and establish themselves. I'm thinking on the hoof here. The main example perhaps was Tibor Reich, who was Hungarian, so he came from Budapest, but he trained in Vienna. Now, of course, Vienna, a different aesthetic. You know, you think of the Kunstgewerbeschule and the Wiener Werkstätte and print and so on. However, Tibor Reich was a weaver, and he too, like Otti Berger, he designed on the loom, and he was very dynamic, and there was a wonderful exhibition at the Whitworth Museum of his work. And he, just one example, he designed a fabric for a competition when the Queen got married, and his fabric was chosen. And it's a wonderful, I'm sure Judith would do so much more in terms of being able to describe it. It's a wonderful woven fabric. It's not printed, there's no pattern on it, and yet it was very, very successful and still sells today, because Tibor Reich's grandson has relaunched the company and still creates the fabrics and they're all hand woven. So there's just one example. Then I'm thinking Kunstgewerbeschule in Vienna. We also had, we're lucky enough to have Jacqueline Groag, and indeed her husband, the architect Jack Groag. And she had made a name for herself already. She was a star pupil in Vienna. She was from Prague, but she studied in Vienna. And she won prizes. By the time she was in her 20s, she'd already designed fabrics for Chanel, for example, Molyneux and so on. And this helped. Yes, so this helped, and she came, and she knew Gropius and all the Bauhaus people and so on. But she was very successful. One mark of her success was, like Tibor Reich, providing fabrics for the Festival of Britain in 1951. Just one last one, just to finish off on a positive note. Miki Sekas, yet another Hungarian. But when we say Hungarian, of course, we're thinking of the sort of Jewish community who were very at home they probably studied in Germany. In fact, Miki Sekas did study in Germany and spoke German, so very much part of that culture. And he established himself in Cumbria, and that company too is still doing well. It still exists today. They're not doing couture fabrics, they only make upholstery fabrics, but nevertheless, they had a good war in the sense that they turned over to parachute silk making, for example, instead of the couture silks that they'd been making. So there we are. We had this huge influx from, not just from Germany. Just one last one springs to mind. We had the wonderful grandmother of Thomas Heatherwick, who was Elizabeth Tommelin. Now, she trained at the Reimannsschule in Berlin, which was a very interesting commercial alternative, say, to the Bauhaus, with a much more practitioner base and a more commercial outlook. And she became head. In fact, she founded the department of printed textiles at Marks and Spencer after the war. So she was designing what British women wore after the war, a hugely important job. And we thank our lucky stars for this absolute wonderful influx of color and texture and knowledge that came from all of these people, as we call it constantly, Hitler's gift to Britain. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I mean, that does, sorry, Tanya, I mustn't hog the conversation, but, that begs the question of, how does one then account for Otti's failure to thrive here? Is it more personal? Is it to do with personality, Judith? Maybe her hearing impediment, her lack of English, her being tugged in the direction of going back to Yugoslavia because of her family, her mother in particular. I don't have an answer, but I'm curious. Tanya, sorry, I must let you talk as well.
Well, I was just going to make a point that Judith will know a lot more than I do, but Margaret Leishman is probably the person
Margaret Leishman,
Leishman is
Leishman, who was at the who was head of RCA weaving, the Royal College of Art, wasn't she? She was Bauhaus. Yeah.
She's really someone. She arrived in 1937, early 38, and she found work at the Royal College of Art, and you know she did thrive, I guess. And she obviously would have known Otti Berger.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say she's, you know, as brilliant and operating at such a high level, but I guess this is something we're going to try and find out about, really.
I think you're right, Monica. It was a must have been, I don't know if Judith agrees, a combination of factors. The fact that she couldn't speak English was a huge disadvantage. And of course, she couldn't lip read, as Judith said, because she was deaf. And she had a mother was ill and so on. I think the timing was most unfortunate. But, you know, I think eventually she would have actually managed to thrive in Britain had the timing been better, and had she had a little more help, and it would, you know, as you say, Leishman was able to thrive, and she was an industrial weaver, you know, and she modernized the whole Royal College of Art textile workshops, and you know, there are a lot of similarities with her and Berger, I think. So I think it was terrible bad luck and our loss.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think luck plays a huge part, does it not, at the end of the day? Sorry, Judith.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, and as far as the letters I know of her speak to me, Otti Berger was a very impulsive person and full of temperament. And imagining that her partner, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, had already managed to go to the States, she was really trying to go there. So if somebody is set up for a certain itinerary and not planning to do the other thing, of course, you also do not invest so much in, right? The intensity, the energy you invest in things is probably not as intense as it would be if you didn't have any other possibilities. So she was always anticipating herself moving to the States, and that's why she didn't, create deep roots for herself in the country. But I would be very, if I may, very interested to open our dialogue also up to the larger public.
Absolutely. I have one very interesting comment and one or two questions, but do please start typing in. Here we are. Yes. Okay. From Valeria Karula Riba. Do Judith and Tanya know? Oh, is this actually a statement, Valeria? Rather, do Judith and Tanya know? Not if, but that Otti contacted architect Godfrey Samuel while she was in Britain. That's an interesting connection.
Yes, I think that name has come up.
Valeria, would you like to unmute yourself and say a little bit more?
Sure. Hello there. Yeah, I mean, yes, it was definitely a statement, but not a question. Yes, we have. I'm photos curator at the RIBH for Judith and Tanya's benefit, and in our collections we have in the Godfrey the archive of Godfrey Samuel, and in the papers there are some letters, the correspondence between the two of them. So I thought that, yeah, if you didn't know already, that you might be interested in that.
Letters between Samuel and Otti.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, that's
wonderful to hear. Thank you so much. We will definitely read into it.
That's marvelous.
Yeah, and Monica, you can put both in touch with me.
I'll do that with great pleasure. And indeed, if anybody else has any little nuggets of information, however small, please do get in touch on the Insiders Outsiders email address, and I'll be very happy to forward the email to Judith and or Tanya.
And have a look, because when we reopen, we're still closed at the moment. But yeah, they're in. I mean, I'm working on a long-standing research project on refugee architects mainly. In Britain in that period, but and Godfrey Samuel was very involved in in trying to help, but obviously he also sometimes got contacted by other individuals, not just architects. And Walter Gropius personally recommended Otti Berger to him as well. So, but the letters by her are all in German. So I haven't read them yet because my German is quite limited, unfortunately. But I'm sure that they're going to be interesting for you.
There was a question apropos that the issue of language. What language did she write in, those letters that you were quoting from, Judith? What language was she writing in?
She always writes in German.
German, okay.
There are a few letters to to Leonard Elmhurst, a couple of very short letters in English. But the final letter she writes to him from Croatia at the end of 1938. She writes it in German. And of course, she always uses lowercase. She doesn't use uppercase.
Yes.
In the spirit of new typography. Perhaps something else that was rather unfamiliar to some of her British correspondence, those sort of exquisite high standards to do with, like on her lovely Christmas card. But
yes, I wanted to show that too. Yeah, I mean, as far as the language is concerned, of course, we didn't mention it all yet, or I mentioned it briefly in my fictional talk, but this is not fiction, but true, that Otti Berger, applied for patents in the UK. She had that done through her patent lawyer in Berlin. And she did it through a law firm in London, and the name has just I just forgot the name now, I'm sorry. But the letters she writes to these people, and she also goes and sees them personally when she is in London in 37 and 38. These letters are also in English, but I guess somebody helped her translating.
It would be interesting, Judith, to know who the law, what the law firm was. There may be some little clue in that piece of information.
Yes, I will look it up.
Yeah, I have a question from somebody called Oliver Botta. Was it in 1938 that Moholy-Nagy wrote to her about a possible position in the United States? If so, then it was the time that the new Bauhaus was being set up. And as we know, within a year, the new Bauhaus had closed down and the school was in crisis and had to be refounded. Not knowing English would again have been a huge disadvantage to Otti. And of course, that's a good observation. Fine. I think probably looking at the time, we ought to begin to draw things to a close, but an interesting comment here from Robert Richardson, if I may. I live in the East Midlands and saw examples of Otti Berger's work for Helios at the 2019 Nottingham Contemporary exhibition called Still Undead, Popular Culture in Britain Beyond the Bauhaus. A really good development that I saw on the local TV news this very week is that a virtual reality version of that exhibition has recently been made available to primary school children, but I don't know whether that includes Otti Berger's work. So Richard, you might like to be in touch with Judith and Tanya about that. And we have another question coming in. Yes, did she acquire the patents? What was the outcome of the attempt to get the patents? Was it successful at all?
Yes. Well, she got a patent in London that was achieved in December 1937 for a rami fiber, very hard wearing. That's one I do know about.
Exactly. So it was in 1936 that they applied for it. It was made of rami, which is a nettle, from the nettle plant, the fibers of the nettle plant, and she developed a tubular steel chair, a spanning fabric for that. So not upholstery, but really just the plain fabric that would be stiff enough to sit on, and or strong enough to sit on and hold your weight, and without any support, no wooden support. It would just hang through it. This was basically an alternative to iron yarn, Eisengarn materials, right? That had been developed earlier at the Bauhaus. And she also developed wall covering materials from the same material, from rami. And I'm just looking for the name of the law firm, but if I will find it in the next minutes, I will.
I'm just wondering, as we talk and listen, whether anybody in the audience knows anything about Otti Berger's connection with Crofton Gain in Bristol, because am I right, Judith, that you mentioned there is evidence that she was employed or at least in contact with them?
Was
anybody
she?
at all?
Yes.
So there are all these tantalizing leads, aren't there, which need still to be pursued. And a question again from Oliver: do we know what language she corresponded with her mother in? Presumably not German?
That's a good question. Some participants might know. I'm sure she corresponded in Hungarian or Croatian language. I don't know original letters from that kind of part of her life, but I just stumbled upon 2 notes which I made to myself and which I wanted to throw in the circle here. There is some notes she received by Walter Gropius where he recommends James McGibbon, Riverside Gardens, London to her, and Morton Sundower Fabrics Ltd, Denton Hill, Carlisle, Alistair Morton.
Yes, now if she'd got in touch with Alistair Morton, that would have been wonderful, because he was, you know,
I don't know if he ever did, but these were 2 recommendations by Gropius, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I perhaps painted too bleak a picture of advanced textiles in Britain, but there was Donald's were making interesting textiles, and Morton Sundower and Edinburgh Weavers. So Alistair Morton, you know, was someone who learned weaving with Ethel Marray and then went on to do more sort of complex types of weaving and weave on an industrial scale. And he was, I think, would have been a very sympathetic figure.
And I also found the name of the company, of the legal company, the patent lawyers, Marks and Clerk. And I think they still exist nowadays. I found them, I contacted them, but they unfortunately don't have any intellectual property lawyers. They don't have any archive holding these kind of correspondences anymore.
And could I say something?
Sorry, I'm not sure, who was that?
Tanya, is Mary Restio?
Oh,
Yes, please do. I was saying, I'm aware that it's now well past 7:30. If anybody needs to leave, and I know a few people have had to leave already, don't feel you have to politely stay on. But for those of you who would like to perhaps contribute more actively, Judith, I think you have a little time to play with, haven't you? You know, why not stay on? Let's use the wonders of Zoom to have a more lively dialogue, perhaps with the audience. So I'll say perhaps goodbye to everyone who needs to leave or feels they want to leave. And thank you very much for being here. But as I say, do stay on, those of you who'd like to enter the conversation. Thank you very much, everybody.
so Mary.
Well, yes. I mean, has anyone been in touch with Mary Schoesser?
I haven't been in touch with her yet, but Mary Schoesser wrote this very useful book about Marion Straub.
I've got mine here, and I was just looking, and all she says about, for a short period when Marianne, this is at Helios, for a short period when Marianne Straub was absent, as you were talking about, Tanya, from Helios, Otti Berger was retained to design woven cloths. And not much more is said. But I mean, Mary, I mean, do you know about Mary? I mean, I know you do, Tanya, but I mean, she's a walking, talking encyclopedia of textiles, living in Essex, in this country. She wrote, you know, this book on Marianne, knew Marianne very well. And so many of Marianne's fabrics, because I've been looking at the illustrations, they're so like Otti Berger's. The ready orange one you had, you know, the sort of movement in it, when you put it up, I thought that was Marianne's thing. And I just think Mary is someone who ought to be spoken to, because
no, I will get in touch with her from the, you know, rather frustratingly, I did interview Marion Straub years ago, but of course at that point it didn't occur to me to ask her about Otti Berger. But
I'm sure Mary would know more.
But see, Marion Straub's training had a sort of Bauhaus link via someone called Zwingli, who taught her in Zurich. So,
yeah.
You know, that kind of.
Marianne wanted to go to the Bauhaus, but her mother realized what was happening in Germany at the time, and she came to England to do technical weaving.
I mean, here's an experimental weave by.
That's nice. Yeah, very nice, isn't it? Yeah.
Straub.
Yeah. But I mean, Marianne's work is looks so like, you know, the Bauhaus and Otti Berger's work. I'm sure Mary would know more.
We have a few more comments coming in from Juliet Kinchin. I'm pretty sure she spoke Hungarian at home, that was the mother tongue. And Magnus, yes, I was fooled by the name coming up, but Magnus England of the Isicon building saying that it was actually Marcel Breuer who drove her to visit Gain in Bristol. So that's a nice little connection for you. Magnus, do you want to chip in at all? Do unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Yes. Well, I've done some research on Croft and Gain, and I've been to Bristol, etc. But I have to confess, I can't remember where I saw that. I do remember that I've seen it, but I can't remember the source of it. But I can look into it and see if I can find it again. But there is a letter somewhere where he physically puts her in a car and drives her to Bristol.
Yeah, it would be great if you could find it again, Magnus. I would be very grateful.
Yeah, I'll try to look into that.
This is really great, this brainstorming. I think it helps a lot. It helps Tanya and myself a lot preparing in the process in which we are in.
Yes, indeed. I should add, I think you already know that the session has been recorded, and the recording will be uploaded on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel that you can find easily enough online. Hold on, I've got something else coming in. This is right, can everybody see? Yes, that's right. No, the Warner Textile Archive, Judith, Tanya, you probably already know this, but there is quite an interesting, short but informative entry about Otti Berger's work for Helios in the chat. It's given. Yes, no, sorry, so where was I? So, yes, to say that it's been recorded, so, I think there will be many other people listening, because in fact, actually, in the end, although over 100 people were signed up, not everybody attends, as always is the case, so I'm sure people will be catching up afterwards, and I'm willing to bet, I certainly hope that, more will come out of this, even if at a slightly later stage. Very good. Well, I think what's coming in now are mostly thanks for your superb presentation, fantastic session, poignant, etc., etc. I will certainly, there's somebody wanting to come in rather late in the day. Let's draw it to a close now, but as I say, don't hesitate to be in touch. Much work to be done. I think actually, if I could just say in conclusion, I mean, clearly this individual story is hugely poignant. And as Tanya says, the kind of official story is that, oh, the big guns didn't fare that well in this country, and they did in the States. That's where they were aiming to head to. But I think, as Anna has reminded us, actually a significant number did stay, did thrive, contributed hugely to this country's culture. And I think we must remember that. Yes, so yeah, indeed. Lovely. Well, thank you all very much. Any last minute thoughts? Go ahead. Sure.
I just wanted to also say a kind of closing word. Forgive me if I do so, and I hope it's not improper, but I think as far as Otti Berger is concerned and her terrible fate, nothing is improper. As Monica mentioned in the beginning, we are in the course of developing a publication on Otti Berger's work, and this is very important to emphasize. It shall really be a monograph on her fabrics and the inner logic of her designer's process, and not so much on her biography. So, the book should be rich in illustrations and bring together all the bits and pieces that are scattered around the world in archives, in drawers where people can't see them and can't build up connections between them, and bring them together in a beautiful and strong book. And so if any of you know of funding sources or are willing to give in a certain amount for that project, we are very happy to receive any help. This is going to happen in collaboration with the Bauhaus Archive in Berlin. And I'm very grateful for the collaboration and wanted to thank the institution at this point in space and time, as I wanted to thank the Bauhaus, Stiftung Bauhaus Dessau, who gave me this wonderful space tonight, and where the exhibition will take place, exhibition on Otti Berger's work, starting from June 24th to October 3rd. So it's really a long time. I will have 2 installations here in the Bauhaus area, one in the Bauhaus building and one in the Bauhaus Museum on Otti Berger. And anybody of you who happens to come to Germany during the summer, please don't miss to see the works, because they contain both original fabrics and large-scale reweavings of her designs. And I think it's really impressive.
Wonderful. And Judith, of course, for those of us who can't make it to Germany, send me the links and I'll make sure that we post the information on the Insiders Outsiders website. So I hope it goes really well. Thank you for making time in the midst of the installation to be here tonight. Many more thanks. Oh, okay, a comment here about funding. Look at the Passold Research Fund. Have you come across them?
Yeah.
It's a new name to me. PASOLD, PASOLD
Nope.
Research Fund, who have a small research project grant supporting specifically textile history research. Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. Mhm.
That's from Chris Boydell. Very good. Lovely. And thanks finally from Anne Angel. Thanks so much to all of you for a wonderful presentation. And Judith, you've truly brought things so vividly into our minds. Hear, hear. Good. I think that's a good point at which to stop. Very many thanks. Yes, absolutely. Wonderful, most memorable. And thank you so much for being here.